You're listening to the PoolePRoof Wisdom Podcast, where we bring our authentic selves, refuse to raise grown folks, and share wisdom you can use. With your host, Charles K. Poole.
Welcome to the podcast, everybody. Today, we're going to get right into it. Jeannette Cooperman is, although she disputed, a writer's writer. As she's described herself, I read, I think, I dig, I write. I worry about whether a sentence like that one should have semicolons instead of commas. But let me tell you, once she moves beyond the worries and those considerations, what she writes makes readers think, feel, and walk away better for having read what sprung from her mind. I've known Jeannette for many, many years and have always been moved by what she writes and how she writes. Although I think of myself as a very good writer, she's a great writer, unparalleled as far as I'm concerned. She has what I consider God-given talent, and it all begins with how she thinks. How she thinks has elevated her work during the decade she spent as an investigative reporter, then her time as a staff writer for a city magazine, who then went on to win multiple national awards. And now she's a staff writer with The Common Reader, a journal of the essay. Jeannette's work has been twice cited in Best American Essays. Oh, and back to that, the way she thinks part, she majored in philosophy and has a doctorate in American Studies. So when I considered that August is National Civility Month, and apparently the entire world needs a reminder that civility matters, I immediately thought the best person to have this conversation with is Jeannette, so here we are. This one's going to be great, a really great conversation. I can just tell. So let's get after it. Jeannette Cooperman, good morning. Welcome to the PoolePRoof Wisdom Podcast. How are you doing this morning?
Fine, in need of wisdom.
Oh, well, we're doing the best we can. As far as I'm concerned, just having you here is just already making my day. So again, thank you very much for joining us.
You are so welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I had been looking, because when I'm doing these podcasts, I'm always trying to think about things I can talk about. The purpose of this whole podcast is to uplift people, to talk about matters that have meaning to real human beings, good people, as I like to call them. And the month of August, where this particular episode is going to debut, is National Civility Month. Yes, there is such a thing. And it really got me thinking, because although they are giving it a month, let's face it, every day we have instances where we're looking at what's going on in the world, and we've got to wonder, what in the hell happened to civility, right? And, I thought about who I wanted to speak with about this subject, and you were literally the first person to come to mind. So,
that's good.
Yeah, you just have this way of thinking and then expressing it that is unlike anyone else I know. And I thought Jeannette will bring some levity to this conversation. So that's what we're here for today. And the audience, I think, is going to love it. So let's just start with the idea of civility itself. Now, if we take a definition of it, I'm going to look at my notes because I want to be specific. But the Merriam-Webster's Learner's Dictionary says that civility is polite, reasonable, and respectful behavior, and that this suggests that these behaviors are the ones we use when we treat others with care. Okay. So with that definition, let's take a little bit of a journey in our lives where we can look back 10, 20, 30, we're going to stop it there, years, and compare and contrast what used to be civility from our individual perspectives and where we think we are now. So hearing that, what are your thoughts about that?
Oh, I think the ability to talk about anything with anybody is what I miss the most, and what feels in retrospect like civility. I took it for granted at the time. I remember sitting on bar stools arguing with dates who were diehard Republicans, and I was in the opposite camp, and we had fun and we went back and necked. It wasn't a problem the way it is now. What worries me the most, you asked for levity, but this is sad.
Yeah.
What worries me the most is that I am now scared in meeting strangers to say certain things. I feel like everything's on shaky ground, and you have to worry about inflaming somebody, antagonizing them, alienating them, turning them into an enemy. I really, really hate that.
Yeah. And when you're having those encounters, what is it that allows you to break through? Or have you been able to break through and decide to go ahead and initiate conversations anyway? Or do you just completely hold back?
No, I don't completely hold back because I'm too old to completely hold back. It's just, if it's worth living a while for anything, it's worth the freedom of it.
Yeah.
So what I do is I feel my way. I think a lot of us do. And I think what works the best is to actually name the problem. To start out by saying, I don't know where you are on this. And then to phrase things like a diplomat, to phrase things so gently and carefully that if somebody's, of like mind, you can get a little more plain spoken, but otherwise you're not inflaming anything. And I think there are ways to do that, to turn something into a question, or to, quote somebody else. That's kind of the cheap, easy way out. But I think you just have to worry about really, maybe we always should have worried about this. You have to worry about assuming anything.
Right.
And you just have to go into it very gently, very tentatively.
So, for me, rightly or wrongly, I may be a little bit, spicier when it comes to my reaction to people. When I was a kid, well, it depends. It depends, because right day, wrong time. You never know what's going to happen. But I remember when I was a kid that my mom would come across certain people and they would be, let's just call it, in a way. And she would kind of look at us and she'd say, let me tell you, that one right there, they woke up with hell in them this morning. So I think that a lot of people these days are waking up with a whole lot of hell in them this morning.
All the time.
Right?
Absolutely.
And it's as if the moment that their feet hit the ground, their intention is to go out and raise some hell as a result of waking up with it in them every day. And I guess the thing is that I kind of, I was born in the 60s, right? So I remember that, there were protests, there were things that were going on. But even in the midst of all of that madness, people seem to at least understand we have a disagreement. We are not having a lifetime battle that requires me to treat you like crap. And
Yes.
that waking up with hell in you kind of concept, what do you think that does to change the dynamic in all of the places we are, in work, at home, and otherwise? How does that represent where we are?
Well, I personally, I don't know what you think. I'm curious what you think is the reason for all that hell. But I think a lot of it, this isn't anything new, is based in fear. Fear of the world changing too fast, fear of losing your standing, whatever. And I think it causes fear. I think it comes from fear, and it causes fear in everybody else. And we all just become kind of scared of each other. And I don't think we remember that civility had some rules.
Right.
There were ways to do these things.
Right.
There's a certain politeness and courtesy that feels absolutely gone, where now we are rejoicing in other people's downfall. And we've been given permission somehow to be as crude, sophomoric, and insulting as any unschooled kid.
Yeah. You mentioned rules, and I'm going to kind of digress here. I pulled up some details when I was researching, and there is I guess you can call it a set of rules, but it was called Rules of Civility, and you'll love this. It was a set of rules composed by French Jesuits in 1595, right?
Yes,
this.
I just found that out. I did the same thing.
Awesome.
Did you read the book?
I started it. I didn't get all the way through before today, but these are things that, as we now both know, rules dealt with different situations and how to be respectful to people, how to be polite when dining with others, and a lot of other things. And the first rule is every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present. Respect is an integral part of civility.
Yeah. And where did that go?
Yeah. The respect thing and the anger and the vitriol that seems to go with it seems to me, and I know that there'll be people who will disagree with me with this, there's been a lack of respect for intellectualism. So a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of times, let me just call it what it is. People are dumb as bricks, and they don't know anything, and
Mhm.
everything is, it's all id. It's no ego or super ego, right? It's just all raw, non-educated emotion. And
Yeah.
it has made it possible for people to not be able to understand the differences between, for instance, what's funny and what's not. I find this
Mhm.
particularly is relevant to a lot of comedians, as they call
Yeah.
themselves today.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking you have to realize that when you're talking about real human beings, that just because you consider it, quote, a joke, it's not funny. And that kind of thing, I think, fuels into what you're saying, this lack of compassion and understanding and appreciation of other human beings. And,
Mhm.
one thing that comes to the fore every time we talk about this is social media. So, talk to me a little bit about your relationship. I'm going to call it that, a relationship with social media. What do you have to say about its impact?
Well, mine is very protected.
Hmm.
I have noticed I'll have friends say, "Oh, I was going to make a comment on your page, but I was nervous." And I'll say, "On my page, you can relax because
Right.
it seems to be that people are really like-minded, and I'm not worried about this kind of haranguing. It just hardly ever happens."
Hmm.
But when I tiptoe outside and I look at the rest of it, I run screaming. I mean, I do
Mm.
not do well with that kind of back and forth, that kind
Hmm.
of meanness.
Right,
Um,
right.
there was a definition that I found,
Yeah.
I did homework too, and I found when you talked about people who are good, it reminded me, they said civility is the everyday busy work of goodness.
Ah, yeah.
And I love that,
Right.
and I think people are hungry for some return, but a lot of people have moved away from religion,
Hmm.
or their religion is not doing so well at preaching goodness. I
Right.
mean, when I hear about people who castigate their preacher for preaching the Beatitudes because they say
Hmm.
that was weak,
Right.
I mean, I find that frightening.
Hmm.
If Donald Trump would be a Christian, would behave as a Christian in my fullest understanding of it, I think I'd be fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's what Chesterton said: Christianity's never been tried.
Isn't that the truth, though? Right?
Great idea. Has
It's
never really been fully tried.
yeah, well, and the thing is, Jeanette, when I think about, and, this will of course be something that gives people, I'm sure, fodder. I grew up Baptist. I ended up going to a Jesuit university. Obviously, we have that in common. Didn't
Mhm.
know anything about Catholicism until I went there. In fact, you remember Mary Bremer.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and one time when there was the old mercantile at the corner of Grand and Lindell, I saw her walking down the street with what appeared to me to be dirt on her forehead. So
Oh, Ash.
I went to wipe it off, and she was like, "No, no, don't do." And I was like, "Well, Miss Brimmer, you've got dirt on your hand." She's like, "No, Charles, that's Ash Wednesday." Didn't know. But
Mhm.
the thing is that the experience of growing up in the church that I didn't expose me to a lot except what I knew. But at that point, I guess it was probably around the time that I was 20-ish, 22-ish, 23-ish. I just had enough because I even found the so-called religiosity of it all
Yeah.
to be spewing hate disguised as lessons. And
Yes.
that is something too, when people go and they call it religion, they call it Christianity. And I'm thinking, this has nothing to do with being a Christian. In fact, Jesus didn't create this. Y'all did,
Mm-mm.
right?
Yep. Yep.
Right? So when
And
we,
Jesus was so
yeah, go
much,
ahead.
excuse me, he was so much about inclusion. And to
Right,
me, any religion that says, we're saved, you're not, we
right,
can have communion, you can't, all these proprietary notions, we're the chosen people, you're not.
right,
Where did
right,
any of that come
right.
from except to raise money
Yeah,
and
raise
power?
money and a lot of other stuff. I won't get into that right now.
Mhm.
I might by the time this is over. So I read the book Cass, The Origin of All of Our, I forgot what she said, problems or things, and I saw the movie.
Mhm.
It changed my life because so many things where I was seeking answers to questions like this one became clear to me there. I'd never thought of all of this as a form of caste. I'd never
Mhm.
thought of it that way, where there's this effort amongst certain people to always have people that they can place themselves above. It changes everything. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's something my husband says all the time that, he'll talk about historically, like poor Southern whites, and how instead of banding together with blacks,
Mm-hmm.
which would have been the logical thing, politicians tried to keep them separate, but also they had to be better than somebody.
Right.
There's that notion, and there's no greater antagonism than down at the so-called bottom of the so-called hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
where people are jockeying to at least be better than somebody.
Right.
And
Right.
I don't know if that's Darwinian, if that's survival skills, if it's ego. What do you think it is?
It's interesting because it goes back to a Lyndon B. Johnson quote about if you take, how did he put it? I'm paraphrasing, this isn't specific, but it was something along the lines, if you take the poorest white man and you tell him something that makes him feel good about who he is, he will let you pick his pocket as long as you're able to justify that he's better than somebody. And I think this goes back to where we are in this world, not just this country, this need for people to find within themselves something valuable. And I think that people really do know themselves pretty well, and they know that they are perhaps broken or something else is not quite right. And the only way that they can do that is to find someone else to make feel even more miserable than they are, so that they can look at themselves in the morning in the mirror, for instance. I think that if you get up and I tell people this all the time, and it's a true story, Jeannette. I look at myself in the mirror and I will say, I love me some Charles K. Poole. Yes, I do.
Lovely. It's so
Yeah,
healthy.
I love that because I know what I've lived with and lived through. But imagine, on the other hand, if I got up and I looked at myself and all I could think is, you're not worthy, you are unattractive, you aren't smart, all the negative things, that inner saboteur, as I like to call it,
I
is
think
what
most people do that.
Yeah, I do. And I think that there's this inner saboteur, the people that take over everything. And so the only way that they can find the way to even make it through that day is to say, well, yeah, I'm that, but these people are worse, or that group is worse, or all of these types of things. And when you do that, going back to your, statement about, doing good, I think that people don't believe good is possible because they haven't necessarily received it. Any thought on that?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. One quick thing about what you just said
Mm-hmm.
first, and that is, I wonder if also that's why there's such attraction to people who are incredibly confident to the point of narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
If so many people feel broken or unworthy or unloved, then of course somebody who thinks they're all that in a bag of chips
All right.
is going to have some extra
Mm-hmm.
magnetism. But I
Yeah.
don't quite know how I mean, well, we'll save that. What I want to know is, surely there was the same degree of self-hatred all along.
Mm-hmm.
You would think that's
Right.
just sort of a human thing based on who gets a loving mom and who doesn't, or a
Mm-hmm.
loving caregiver. Um, I'm simplifying it. But why does it seem that more people, is it again just like the fear of change? Have we outstripped our ability to cope? Why is it more prevalent now?
Mm.
Because I do think you're right. I think there's a sense of brokenness and people striking out and having to be better. Is it because they were always automatically better, than now that
Mm.
we're trying to make things more equitable, they've
Mm-hmm.
lost that?
So let's go back a little bit to that, question that we were kind of tiptoeing around earlier on the social media front, which is, I think that with the advent of social media, particularly, everyone has a life that is elevated, and everyone is the best of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And when you are looking at that, if you've got that inner saboteur and you're looking at everybody else who has this lifestyle that you covet, that you believe is so valuable, and then you look at your own life, you
Yeah.
start looking for ways that you can perhaps make those experiences that they're having seem less important by having a mission and a sense of values that perhaps it's considered negative, evil, wicked, whatever it is, but you're going to
Mm-hmm.
make people suffer for the fact that they don't see you. When you hear about people who have, engaged in major shooting incidents. And should those people survive, you can find that they are someone who says, well, I never had a girlfriend and the girls all treated me horribly, so I'm going to make everyone suffer. So as a result, they take all that vitriol that builds up inside them and they push it out into the world so that it doesn't stay within them, because what will happen eventually is that reservoir is going to spill over one way or the other, either in terms of them harming themselves, but unfortunately, it takes the role of harming other people. Doesn't matter if they were the people that you felt mistreated you. I mean, when you've got someone who goes and kills children, what can you say? But I do think that there's this tendency to take all this built up sense of the rest of the world is having a great time and having a great life, and I'm not, and I don't like it, so I'm going to make them suffer. That's kind of a theory of mine.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And the logic is so skewed. It's like, let's go out in a burst of glory and hurt as many people as possible first. And then you end up killing yourself anyway. What have you gained? Nothing.
Right.
Caused a lot of harm. But I think that's so smart what you said about people not feeling seen. Because as much as I cringe at all the criticism of the media and of liberals in the old-fashioned way, there's some truth to it. There has been a lot of ignoring of whole chunks of our culture. And, there was just sort of an in-group mentality and you went to certain sources, but the others were too hard to reach or get access to. And there's been a lot of people who felt invisible. And I think part of the anti-intellectualism that's always been in this country is if you don't have a certain pedigree, you realize you are invisible already. You come into the arena that way. So what else are you going to do but despise it?
Yeah. And, it's an interesting thing because, that ability to build people to a point where they can feel that while it's nice for people to see you, you must first see yourself is something that I'm really connected to. I was very fortunate, from all of the things you've seen. I'm a mama's boy who gives her all of the credit for the fact that she saved me from not having a concept about myself that was born of what other people thought, but what I knew inherently. So when she told me and my siblings at the time, I don't care what we do or don't have, I always need you to know you are not your circumstances. You are not your circumstances. You can be anything you want to be, but you've got to believe that in order to change those circumstances. And that is a very important lesson, I think, because when people are put into the boxes that they're supposed to be in, based on someone else's perspective, they wonder, is that where I really belong? And if they buy into that over time, that's what they become. And as I said, I often tell people when I'm speaking to groups, I said I was born in 1963. Given the time that I was born in and the environment in which I was born into, I was supposed to be on drugs, in jail, or dead.
Yeah.
That's the reality of what was supposed to happen for someone like me at that time. But because of the environment I grew up in, and though we did not necessarily have everything and we had some hard times, God knows we did, what I was given, instead of feel as if you are less than because you don't have what everyone else has, instead being given, you are not your circumstances. Always imagine what you can be. And I think that people aren't given the impression that they can be anything other than what people tell them that they're supposed to be. When I say something from time to time on social media, I don't have a lot of issues with it either, because I'm just like, I don't even know you, so why do I care what you say? Blocked. You're out of here. But, people will be like, you're such and such and liberal and blah. And I said, you just showed your hands. I said, you don't know me from Adam, but you take a look at what I look like and you assume that you know who I am. I voted for all kinds of people over time, right? But you want to believe, because it suits your narrative of anger and hate, that because I am the person that I am, that I only have one way of thinking. That's your limitation. Don't you dare try to cast it on me. So when you're having those kind of conversations, and I'm sure you have great intellectual conversations. I can only imagine. I would sit in the room and pay to hear you have a conversation with certain people. I really would. But when you're having a tough conversation, what is the cut in point and the cut out point? Meaning, what is the point that you figure this is something that we should be having a discussion about versus the point where you're just like, this person is never going to embrace any other way of thinking. I need to just exit. What is that for you on both of those issues?
Well, what I have found through painful experience is that some people have a way of establishing truth that is entirely different than mine. For example, we used to have, I'm not religious anymore, but back when I was Episcopalian, we had this theological cafe, and we would just talk openly about all sorts of questions. And a gentleman showed up, and he started coming every week, and he brought his Bible. And anything that was said or explored, he would turn and find a passage and read it to us, and then as though that was done deal and he had won the point. And it became utterly uncomfortable, and we stopped doing it. It's the same thing as when somebody says, do your research. And what they mean is go look at some crap online that hasn't been fact checked or verified. If I'm talking to somebody who agrees on how we go about verifying something, we can talk forever. But if people's entire worldview about how truth is established and checked is at odds with mine, you can't talk. There are people I can't talk to anymore, and that's part of the sadness of it.
And the maturity level, excuse me, the maturity level has a lot to do with this, because there are people who seem to just gravitate toward the ability to argue with other people and
win. They want to win.
And win, right. And I always wonder, because for me, if people start going off the chain, I'm just like, oh, no, not today. Not today, Satan, right? So we're going to stop this, and I'm going to say, just like I said earlier, listen, you and I, if we disagree about something, that's fine. Life goes on. But I don't have the contentional way of thinking that you do to want to stand here and argue with you about something that ultimately, in the whole grand scheme of things, will not matter. And yet most people that I see in that social media context, again, they will go in there and then they start writing back and forth, and other people will win. And I'm just like, what in the world is wrong with you people? And a lot of them are nameless and faceless, so they can hide behind it. So
that's a big part of the problem.
Right, because they are out there doing things. And, that's the interesting thing sometimes when these people are revealed with their vile points of view, with a picture and a name, all of a sudden they go away. But when you're having these conversations with people and they get to that point where they're becoming heated and you extricate yourself, as do I, you have any speculation on why some people just feel compelled to keep going and keep going and keep going? Anything?
Well, I think it's a bit, none of us really knows a lot about the world right now because problems are complicated. Right. Whether the planet's burning, the environment, all this stuff requires a degree to understand each problem. So if you buy into a certain set of assumptions, a certain worldview, a certain list of so-called facts, you're collaboratively building this edifice. And if you pull any bricks out of that, it all starts to fall. And I think people can't tolerate the thought of that. And so giving up even a small point is loosening the mortar. And so I think that's why there's a lot of echo chambers. There's a lot of everybody shoring each other up, more and more links, all saying the same thing. It's an edifice that they're building in order to feel like they at least know what's going on.
Right.
No matter how elaborate the conspiracy theory is.
Oh my gosh, the conspiracy theories.
But it's so interesting to me too, because you just talked about the anonymity of it. The invisibility is the problem, and then people are invisible to deal with the problem.
That's right.
You would think they would be trying to have more of a physical and presence in the world.
There's that word, though, again, we would think. That's the thing that's missing.
The thinking.
Yeah, the thinking part. So I came across a American Bar Association survey. You may have already done it too, knowing you. No. But it was from last year. But there are 2 points here I'm going to reference. And one of the points, which follows the first, I found kind of ironic. And you'll see why I mean here in a second. But a big majority of people said civility in today's society is worse than it was 10 years ago. So that's a whopping 85%. I don't know what
Yeah.
those other 15% are thinking. But then when I read the second point that said 29% said social media is primarily responsible for eroding civility, and another 24% blamed the media generally, and 19% blamed officials. So,
Officials.
yeah, officials. So I kind of stuck on that same word too, officials. I'm like, okay, I'm assuming they mean government, or do they mean business? I don't really know what that means. But it's like when people get into office and don't do the job that they're supposed to do, and people keep reelecting them, there's a sense of disconnect from people saying that officials are responsible when they're the ones who are doing the electing of them.
Right.
And I think that it kind of spoke to me in the context of, well, there are people who every day can look past horrible things that people say and do for whatever reason they do, even if they are somehow supporting that person in one way or another. So there's this tendency I think we have in this country in particular, and I'm sure it is the same elsewhere, where we think that what other people do that we allow isn't necessarily our responsibility when we're the ones helping to promulgate it. Do you
Right.
think that that's true?
Yes, I
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, we don't take, well, what we don't understand anymore is a shared responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we didn't vote for somebody, we're
Right.
part of a country that did.
Right.
And so there's a certain element of, okay, like it or not, this is this country's president, or this is this country's official or health
Right.
department, whatever. So yeah, I think the whole notion of feeling like you're part of a participatory democracy and feeling powerful, like you have some sort of voice, that's been eroding since we were little.
Yeah.
People got bitter and cynical. And the more you study large sweeping forces in society and economics, the more you decide, well, it's just little old me. What can I do?
Right.
You know,
Right.
and in part that's true. Like we spend all this time sorting our recycling, and yet there are corporations that are dumping things. It is a sort of
Right.
odd arithmetic, but we really have lost the sense, I think, of having any control over our world,
Right. Right.
which is not a good place to be.
Scary. And
Well, and then you feel entitled to play spectator and just sit there and be nasty.
yeah. And as long as
Because-
it's not immediately or directly from your assessment impacting you or yours, that's stuff
Right.
that happens to other people. So it doesn't really matter, right? So
And that's why I think local politics is still a little bit healthier. And sometimes it gets swept in weird ways, but I think there's still a sense of engagement and community because we can grasp this little tiny place.
interesting.
Everything else is just too big.
So how do you look at that? And I love that you introduced that, because now it made me think of something. Since I've gotten back to St. Louis after my
We're very glad.
well, thank you. That's sweet of you. After my stint elsewhere for many, many years, to come back and still have this city-county thing,
Ugh.
I'm like, really? You still haven't figured this out after all of this time? And it, speaks to what you were just saying, though, because yes, we're talking about the metro region that we all are supposed to represent, but we can't seem to get it right. I'm in the city right now. As Logan will tell you and other people who are here at this studio, I was like, I think this is maybe the only time I come into the city. And I grew up here, right? So I should be completely comfortable. But it's just a different place. And it seems like it's becoming more and more of a ghost issue every day as everything goes west and so on and so forth. But now there's this perception that the city belongs to them. I'm not going to define who them is, so it's not my problem. I'm going to go out here where us feel better. And so that very thing you're talking about is at play in this particular area. And we are not a metropolitan area, really. We are different entities. You think so?
Well, the roots of this are so old and so deep, and there's so
Mm,
much racism involved, and there's so
hmm.
much economic power grab involved that it's just intractable. And
Right.
it's funny, you just busted my theory because I live in a small town now over in
Hmm.
Illinois. And so
Ah,
when I was saying local small politics is healthy, I'm talking about that teeny tiny
right.
place.
That very
When
centralized.
you now talk about city and county, I think
Hmm.
people feel just as helpless as they do nationally.
Hmm. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think St. Louisans have given up.
Yeah. The giving up part is always intriguing to me because it's hard sometimes, as much as I have learned, not to expect of other people what you have learned to do yourself. I will acknowledge that. And, as I look at my own history and I think about the things that I, my family, and others I've seen have lived with and lived through, and people will come and say, "Oh my God, I don't know how you survived that." And the response is always the same for me. I didn't have any other choice other than to give up. And I've never been a person who knows how to do that because for the vast majority of my life, I mean, I've lived in this body, in this country, in this world, and I've had to make it work regardless of what was happening around me. There's no other choice. So giving up has never been an option for me. So that kind of thing where people are always saying, oh, it's somebody else's problem. I'm like, no, it isn't. My basic life goal, the reason I do this podcast, the reason I do all the things I do is to put more good into the world than I take from it. That's
Mhm.
literally why I do
Beautiful.
it. Because I figure coming from where I've come from that I've already gotten a lot of good, a lot of grace, right, in my life. And that having survived things I didn't think I would survive, it is now my job to try to help ensure that others are able to not have to endure those things. So I can't in my head, Jeannette, fathom why anyone else would just think that the only reason that they're here is to do for them and for theirs. You have any
Yes.
reflections on that?
It sounds so lame, but what I notice is that people feel, I think, a little bit overwhelmed. The
Mm-hmm.
deluge of 24/7 news, all this horrible stuff going
Mm.
on all the time, all
Yeah.
around them. And it's so hard right now to even raise kids in this world.
Mm-hmm.
It's so much harder than it used to be. You
Yeah.
don't have neighbors you can count on. You don't have a community. You don't have a school you can trust. You don't have,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much crime. There's so much danger that I think it takes everything people have to figure out the work world, to figure out how to raise a family. They're trying to live in ways that they've been prescribed to live in.
Mm-hmm.
We have to have 2.3 kids, we have to have a
Right.
certain income level, we have to have whatever. And they don't have any mental energy left.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see. It's a
Oh
lame
wow. Yeah.
excuse. And I think if somebody presented to them an easy path that felt effective to make a difference, all that would drop away.
Mm-hmm.
I think they'd find a way.
Mm-hmm.
They'd say, okay, yeah, I'll get the kids, I'll get the babysitter, do the work thing.
Mm-hmm.
I got it. I'll be there at 7 tonight. I'll help you. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I think so much volunteer work ends up being time wasting or ego
Right.
stroking or whatever. It's not efficient and exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Obama's campaign was,
Mm-hmm.
they handled that really well.
Mm-hmm.
But people need to be made to feel like they're actually doing something that helps and makes a difference. And I don't think there's enough of that out there. I wish that there were sort of a general Peace Corps for all of us within this country
Mm.
where we all were expected to do a little something.
Mm-hmm.
That notion of service, I think, is important.
Right.
And
Right.
I'm guilty. I don't do it. I
Mm-hmm.
feel like I'm swamped just living. But
I can
somebody
relate.
needs to come to me and
Mm-hmm.
say, you need to do this.
Well, it's an interesting thing. I'm going to extend a little grace to you. You write and give people an opportunity to think. And again, you haven't heard it here, but you'll hear it in the lead in when the podcast comes out. But I think that what you do is that you're giving people that option of interpreting for themselves what has value and what they're going to do with it. That is doing something. A lot of people
Mhm.
don't write, don't speak, don't do anything. All they do is the day in and day out and blame the hell out of everybody else for whatever the
Yeah.
lot their life may be at that point. You
Yeah.
are exploring questions and trying to put things out there in a way that not only you, I mean, I always tell people, I don't know if you feel this way, but I tell people all the time, I've never had a therapist because writing is my therapy.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So you're
Hmm.
working through it. And in working through it, you're sharing those experiences with other people like me who take
Hmm.
from what you write. Oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way before. Maybe I can do this. So you
Hmm.
may not think you're doing something, but I see exactly what you're doing.
Okay,
So
well, that helps.
yeah, it
Uh,
really does. I mean, when you see people respond to what you write, it's always with the idea of, wow, this is giving me something. And you're giving
mhm,
people something. So don't be so modest.
okay.
Okay.
The other piece too, and again, these things sound kind of lame as excuses,
Mhm.
and the word is so overused that I think we're all just sick of it. But stress,
Yeah.
because I think what happens is people go home and just sit down and stream something.
Mhm.
I think they just want the world to wash over them, and they
Mhm.
want to be taken away because they're so exhausted
Mhm.
mentally.
Right.
And some of that is just our
Mhm.
bodies have not
Mhm.
caught up to the world.
Mm.
We're still
Mhm.
trying to fight saber-toothed tigers every time
Mhm.
somebody cuts us off.
Mhm.
And until we learn that what we're stressed out about isn't that important,
Mhm.
there are very few things of all the things that stress people out and start that
Mhm.
corticosteroid,
Mhm.
adrenaline stuff going.
Yeah.
Very little of it is actually worrisome,
I know.
but we're still physically primed to
Mhm.
react.
Mhm.
And because we're so reactive, we're then exhausted.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I do think that that's a piece, not the whole
Yeah.
thing, but I think that's a
No,
piece of
I
it.
can't disagree with you. I loathe worrying. I don't worry.
Right.
I
So
I
you're
gave
uniquely good at not
well,
doing
it took
this.
a lot of years to get there, but I gave worry the kiss off years ago because,
Yeah.
being rational, I kept thinking to myself, Jeanette, what is it I'm getting from worrying?
Right.
And the answer was consistently nothing. So
Mhm.
if it doesn't net me something that's going to help me with my situation, why am I engaging in it? So it
Right.
goes with stress. People take on stress often unknowingly because they think they're doing what they're supposed to do,
Right.
right? And when life is interjecting all these different things, we're just like, well, that's just life. No, it isn't. That's just a decision to accept that this is what you think life has to be.
Yes.
So part of this thing about civility is often being perceived as polite. I'm not the politest person, but I am
Mhm.
honest.
Yeah.
So, if things get to a point where my reservoir is going to be flooded, right, with all of this stress, I'm going to push back. And I think there is something interesting with people who are so angry and still so stressed out and all of the other things, where they still have some semblance of that civility because they think, I can't really push back against someone telling me something that I need to do, which is going to only add more stress to my life, right?
Yes.
And they
Yes.
take it on and then they're angry about it. They're not dealing with it. And it only makes them more of this person that they shouldn't be because they think that they're doing the things that they're supposed to do. So if you come to me years ago after InBev took over Anheuser-Busch, and I decided after 3 years of watching what they did that it was not for me. It was literally part of what led to me getting to this point. But I would be on a call with them, although in a different state, just knowing that I had to talk with them. I was all bent out of shape. My stomach was in knots, like people describe it. It was horrible. And I was not doing well as a result because it was just such a dynamic difference. And I tried it for 3 years to prove to myself that I hadn't just given up.
Yep.
But, I ended up leaving, and I actually wrote about it then, and I called it, giving up a paycheck, getting a life, because that's
Oh,
what I
beautiful.
felt I did. Yeah. But the thing is that stress was starting to take control of me, and I discerned that I did not want to allow it to do that. And the good thing that came out of that experience afterward was I told myself, from now on, when I work, it's going to be on my terms to avoid the stress. So
Yes.
I therefore vanquished all of that anger, I think, and all of that
Mhm.
frustration, because the way that I am now, the moment it starts crossing the line of limitation for me, I'm going
Mhm.
to stop it. So I don't have
Yeah.
stress. I don't worry. And I also know that for people who are I think high achievers who are used to thinking that if you stop doing something that's harming you, that you're giving up, to help them move into an area where they're able to separately express that by saying, no, I didn't give up. I just had enough.
Yes.
That's a distinction.
Well, the more people who hear stories like that, because so many people, I think, get trapped in somebody else's notion of how much money they need to make, how many promotions they need to have. I know when I was too stressed being the editor-in-chief of a city magazine, and I said, can I please just be a staff writer? And people said to me, why would you do that? Huge pay cut, huge loss in this glamorous, supposedly, job. And finally, somebody said, oh, I get it. You'd rather do stuff than tell people what to do. And I said, thank you.
Right.
Can we just cast it in those terms and not be thinking of it as a loss of glamour or title or money, or none of that means a damn thing. But people get trapped by it.
Right.
And they forget that they're in charge of their life and that they can do a lot to shape the conditions.
Right.
I mean, when I was that stressed, I lost all creativity. I lost all ability to have my own thoughts because too many people were tugging at my sleeve all the time, wanting immediate decisions. And I just lost who I was. And it took months to get it back.
Yeah. Yeah. I can really listen. You giving a whole sermon right there, Jeannette, because there are people everywhere who are more concerned about what other people think than what they think of themselves. It's frightening. And I think that in elevating the conversation last month, and actually the month before, it was mental health awareness. And I did a segment on that because that's huge. But we are expecting more and more and more of people in so many different ways. And people don't feel they have the bandwidth to have that control, as you mentioned. And it's killing people. It's an interesting trend I see sometimes out. I post things on TikTok now, but it's not me dancing or something else.
Oh, damn.
Yeah. It's pictures and text and this type of thing with a soundtrack, but it's still out there. But so as a result, I've seen some things, and I had been noticing a trend lately where a lot of people who are described as TikTokers or influencer TikTokers have committed suicide.
Oh.
And I began to wonder about that because I was just like, well, they were a successful influencer. Lots of people knew who they were. They had, different types of partnerships with different types of companies that were making the money. They had the life, right? But something was missing. Yeah. No matter what the appearances are, something was missing. And I don't know these people, so I'm only speculating, but that part of yourself where you believe that you are who you are and that you are valuable, that you are seen, that you are heard, that you are mattering to other people, I think that's missing. And no matter how much all of the stuff around you may appear, you don't feel like you're enough. They take their own lives. And they're made to
feel contingent upon how many likes, how many followers, how many whatever. You can take even somebody with a fairly healthy, stable ego and put them in a job where they're constantly asked how many it went up. Oh, you lost 20,000 followers. Oh my God. That would be nerve-wracking.
Because it's all that you decide is your value. Now, I can tell you, in fact, I just posted something today because, 37,000 people on Instagram. And that's fine. That's wonderful. But I made a note in there because I wanted people to understand something. When I started this, I had one goal because I'm in a podcast studio now. I pay to have a podcast done. Nobody's paying me, right? My thing was always this. If on any given day, among the various things I do, there is one person out there who comes across it, reads it, or it helps them in some way, then I've done what I've set out to do.
Exactly.
I don't covet running after people to do things. I always get things from, these different apps saying, here, boost this. And I'm like, no, I'm not doing all of that. If it means something to you, use it. Here it is. It's free. You can use it. That's all there is to it. But I think you've hit on a very important point about people who value themselves based upon whether, again, they get the like or the share or whatever the case may be. And let's go ahead and extrapolate that to just the overall thing that we're seeing happening in the world right now, where angry people, the people who are trying to turn back the clock on all kinds of things, They are trying to find a place where they can then feel like they are a part of something that they're comfortable with, that other
Yes.
people are comfortable with, that they can make happen by taking away from those people that they figure are unworthy or not of their caste, whatever we're going to call it,
Mm-hmm.
is going to make them feel like they are the person on the top of the hill.
Yeah.
And the thing that's interesting about that as an approach is that that point that you made about the social media thing is going to happen there too. At some point, the winds are going to shift. You aren't going to have the same level of engagement. People aren't going to think and feel the same way that you do. What do you do then? Because revolution can only happen so often, and you're going to be stuck. Do you see that as being a parallel? Because we can go back to the past, but the past failed for a reason.
Yes. And it will fail again. And the biggest question I have is, what would have been the best way to move forward toward a society that was more fair and more inclusive and more equitable? Because a lot of this, I feel like, is reactive. People were made to feel like they were less than because they were told that they were racist. They were told that they couldn't say certain things. They were told that they were uneducated. They were told whatever. And then now it's like, by God, we want our world back, and we'll tell you that you're not good enough.
Right.
My husband and I argued about whether or not it's better to have a veneer of civility, whether people feel like they have to behave a certain way in public. And then when they're in private, they can use whatever slurs and language they want. But in public, they have to behave a certain way. That got taken away.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, anything can happen in public. You saw kids, mouthing off in ways that would have shocked anybody 10 years earlier. And I still feel like the veneer is healthy, but Andrew's point was it ferments. It foments, and then suddenly it blows because it goes under the surface, all that hatred.
Yeah.
And I don't know which way. I don't know how you proceed when you have a country that is as bigoted on all sides as ours is.
Yeah. It's an interesting, question. I grew up with people using names. It was just normative for me. But, and it is for a lot of people, because the thing that's so interesting about where we are now is that people are trying to change everything for so many different people. It kind of reminds me of church in this instance. When I used to go to church, I would always reflect, oh, yeah, you definitely have your favorite sins because you preach the same sermon about them every Sunday. It used to be that people had their, favorite groups of people to be bigoted or whatever toward. But look at it now. Look what's happening with women, right? The hatred toward women is off the chain, right? The hatred toward people, the things going on with Jewish people right now, the stuff that's going, the black and white scenario has been with us forever. So that ain't nothing new. But what's intriguing to me is the number of people who are always finding other people that they have beef with, right? That they figure aren't worthy. And they always are somehow missing the point that, I can't remember the name of the guy who did the poem, First They Came for So-and-so.
Yes.
These people will have no ends to their level of bigotry and hatred eventually, because they're going to always think there's someone who is less than they are. They're coming for everyone. And so whether it's a lack of civility in real time, or it's just some type of long-term plan, which I think there is one. We both know what it's called. But the thing is, the lack of awareness that at some point when you live that way, you will be the person that someone else decides is less than, boggles my mind. How can people not see it?
Is it a lack of awareness, or is that the deepest fear? Is that the motivator?
Okay.
My God, we have to make sure we're up here because we don't want to be the ones that get.
That's right.
I think there's a ton of white people who feel like we did all this to black people, and if they're in power, they'll do that to us.
Yeah. And then there's this other part too, and we're going to be wrapping up here because we'll be on here for 6 hours, and you don't have that much time, neither do I. But I always point out to people, and I'll probably be eviscerated for saying this publicly, but every group that is discriminated against, hated, whatever the case may be, within their own ranks have people who are doing that at a different level as well. So it's almost as if people tend to forget, I remember once when I worked in Jefferson City, I had become the first communications director for the state treasurer at the time. And I was sitting outside his office while he was meeting with members of the Black Caucus for the state. And he was explaining to them that he'd hired this, young African-American man, and he had this pedigree and this, and this. And I will never say who it is. I'll tell you secretly another day. But one of the people perked up, well, he's Black, but he's not one of ours. I will never forget it for the rest of my days. Ouch. And yet these are people who are parading around talking about the fact that they're here supporting the community. But when someone who has no ties or, privilege associated with whatever they think is appropriate shows up, instead of celebrating that, their only retort is the one that I just said. So it exists within the groups themselves, that kind of self-hatred. And I think that's another thing that we're going to have to look at when it comes to civility, is that where self-hate takes seed, it will grow, and its growth is going to reach other people. If you're raising kids, you're going to teach them that crap. If you are engaged in groups where people seem to welcome those conversations, that's what people learn. But at the end of it, the only question that matters ultimately is, who are you and who do you think other people have the right to be? Any thoughts on that?
I think you're right. That is the ultimate question. I think it has gotten hard, though, because we have, I'm just going to say this country is divided in two. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you just take the two sides that are most obvious, they're a completely different version of what a country is. The social contract, whether we're a republic, what democracy looks like. It's a completely different set of values, priorities, ways of dealing. And so I think honoring that other side is far more complicated than it used to be, because there's not a common agreed framework even. We've lost that very notion of what a country is.
Yeah. And I think as we wrap, this is where I am. I try to take life experiences and wrap new ones that occur within that same coverage, right? Because based on what we've talked about today, oh my gosh, it sounds terrible what we have ahead of us, right? But I always think that save for historically, the stories amidst all kinds of upheaval, hardship, the most horrible things we've thought about, there have always been the good people, as I like to call them. And that somehow, even when it seems that everything is lost, something emerges that allows goodness and possibility to permeate everything else. I have to, because of who I am and what I've seen, believe in that. Do you have a different point of view, or have you just said, I'm throwing up my hands?
I think that's absolutely true. And that's what I count on. What has been, I think, the most disappointing, hard thing has been how many people I would call good people have been willing to accept conduct that I would say was not very good to accomplish other ends.
Right.
And that to me is the part that is really tough. Because I look at people that I know I would like, that I would treasure, that are wonderful, that are kind, that help the world. And I see that they're willing to tolerate something that they would never do. And that's the part I can't wrap my head around still.
Right.
And that's the part that depresses me. But I agree with you. Human beings are still more good than evil. And we just have to find a way for all the good impulses to soften our relationships.
Yeah. I am wearing one of my T-shirts. I need to send you one. You'll appreciate. I'm gonna send you that one about if you and I agree. Plus this one
excellent.
too. But
I
this one says that 100% of my worst fears I've survived. And that is true, I think, for a lot of people. They don't necessarily think of it in context. So as we wrap up here, Jeannette Cooperman, I want to just kind of end on this note. It is going to be National Civility Month, and a lot of people may think that that's a joke, but if we really want to be civil, I have a notion that we need to start with ourselves, because we don't necessarily all treat ourselves very well. And I think that the better we treat ourselves, that's the reason I'm a fan of intensive self-care, the better we will be able to engage with the rest of the world. Do you have any final thoughts on that question?
No, I agree with you completely. And I don't think people think it's a joke. I think they're hungry for it. I think we're all hungry for it. We slide so easily into insults and exasperation because we're at a very difficult, polarized place.
Yeah.
But we've got to find a way to get past that. And I think we will.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
If nothing else, sinking this low in terms of civility is making all of us hunger for it.
Yeah.
And something really good can come out of that.
Yeah. We have
so many people are fed up with the rancor and the fear of each other and the suspicion. Something much better has got to come out of that.
There you go. There you go. Ending on a positive, uplifting, and hopeful note. Jeannette Cooperman, thank you. As I told you, I knew it was going to be a great conversation, and I thank you for having it with me.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of the PoolePRoof Wisdom Podcast. We always enjoy the company. Be sure to listen, like, subscribe, and share using Google and Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, Anchor, Overcast, YouTube, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this episode, we'd appreciate it very much if you simply tell a friend about the podcast too. Spread the word. Until next time, keep on living.